Hello and welcome everyone to Sydney Ideas. I'm Phoebe and super excited to be here tonight with Zara, especially because we both studied at Sydney Uni. And I was saying before we came on here, the last time I was in this room was doing my contract law exam, and so grateful to be here in more enjoyable circumstances. So I'm the founder of Missing Perspectives, and for those who don't know, we're a global media company that's dedicated to platforming young female reporters and content creators all over the world. And super excited to be a host for tonight and interview my brilliant friend Zara Seidler. So I'm going to give Sydney Ideas a plug while I'm up here. Sydney Ideas is the University of Sydney's flagship public talks program, and I know we're up here for Sydney Ideas, but there are genuinely good talks coming up, and also head over to their website and check out the episodes on demand. Before we begin proceedings, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. Tonight we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and sovereignty was never ceded.
Now to introduce Zara. I know you all know who she is, but here's the bio. Zara is the co-founder of The Daily Oz, a social-first news service that engages over 250,000 young Australians a day. And yeah, definitely follow them now if you're not, because that's incredible. She's a presenter, commentator, business leader, Forbes 30 Under 30, and now adds author to her many hats and achievements with the release of No Silly Questions this September. So welcome, Zara.
Thank you.
I think your intro and achievements just grow every time we sit down.
Very kind.
I cannot. So I think what's really funny about you and I sitting up here talking about running news and media companies is that you and I actually didn't study media or journalism at uni.
Exactly.
Which I think to me says a lot about the way the news industry has evolved, and that a lot of the new players like you and I and Hannah Ferguson from Cheek Media actually didn't study journalism, and I think we had very unconventional career paths to get where we are today.
Absolutely.
And I know it's really cliche that you can connect the dots looking backwards, but how did every role you've had kind of lead you to launching TDA? Because you were in politics. Anyway, yeah. Start from the beginning.
No, but I think the proposition is an interesting one, because I think that when I first started the Daily Oz, I think I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder about not having been a journalist. I couldn't comfortably use the term journalist when I hadn't studied it. I didn't know what made somebody a journalist. But as you very rightly pointed out, studying journalism isn't the only way to become a journalist. But I think that the journey was just that I studied international and global studies here, and I think was always just curious. And I think that it's that curiosity that fed into what I do now, but it's the curiosity that led to my brief career before that. So worked at Sky News very briefly, then worked in lobbying and worked for a politician. And I think that the common thread between all those things was a curiosity to better understand politics and better understand why and how young people weren't engaging in what I knew to be a deeply engaging space. And so then came the Daily Oz, and that has really, for me, created the opportunity to explain the news in a way that I wish I had growing up as a news consumer. And I think the fact that I didn't study journalism, our political journalist didn't study journalism, he's an economist by trade, but he understands things so deeply, but can also explain them in a way that makes sense to you and I. And that he hasn't had years of trying to build spin or learning different ways to say it. He's just saying it, how he'd want to in a conversation. And I think that's a real asset.
But I also think, I think it's funny when Sydney Uni gave me your bio, it actually included you're a leading journalist. And I thought that was really interesting because at least I don't consider myself a journalist.
I don't think I consider myself
But
a
I'm not
journalist
sure
either.
why. And I think it's that I have this outdated notion in my mind of what a journalist is.
I think so too. And I think I always struggle. There are two people that you have to be able to explain your job to, your hairdresser and your grandmother. And I think that when you can't do either of those things, you're like, oh God, what am I doing? And for a really long time, I struggled with this one because I was like, saying I'm a business owner sounds wanky as hell.
Yeah.
Saying that I'm a journalist, I feel like a fraud. So I just be like, yeah, I do some startup-y things in the news space and follow the Daily Oz.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. And I think that I just need to work through those identities. And I think that journalism can take many different forms. And I think that's the acceptance that I've reached is that, you know, I might not consider myself a journalist, but I think that I practice the craft of journalism every day.
And I was reading an article last week about the role influencers now play in the news industry. And I thought that was really interesting because they're kind of like delivering the news, like as long as it's fact-checked and evidence-based. And I think with us, like with the earthquake in Morocco, we actually had a young woman on the ground who was a local just provide her perspective and like show what was happening on the ground. And it got a lot of engagement with our audience, but it wasn't the traditional way of delivering news and commissioning it either.
It's changed.
Yeah.
And I think with the decentralization of information and of news, if you have a phone, you can document and you can share information. And if you can access the internet and you can share and disseminate that information. The barrier to entry in terms of journalism is lower than it's ever been. And so I think you're right. I mean, influencers, the Daily Oz's early growth, I always attribute to influencers because we would get messages from influencers who might have been former Miss Universes or they might have been bikini models, or whoever they were. And they'd say, I'm getting pressure to talk about, I don't know, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I am not equipped to talk about that. Can you please send me something that is factual based that I can share with my followers? And so even though these people didn't have a connection with their audience around news topics, they were getting pressured to say something. And so we saw very early on that people were relying on us to be able to share that information with their followers because the way that young people especially are getting their news today is, for obvious reasons, very different.
But even like, I know it's not news, but statistics came out today around like millennial women are now going to TikTok for searching for information over Google, which was just crazy. Anyway, we have gone straight into it, but like going back a bit. So I think we both were avid consumers of news despite not being in the news industry. And I think to me, we both saw a similar gap in that I thought women weren't being spoken to or catered for. You thought young people weren't being catered to. And how did TDA come about?
So
I don't even know this.
Yeah, I mean, it depends when you ask me. I think that I've started doing a bit of revisionist history because everything's just a bit of a blur. But essentially, I had always grown up caring deeply about the news and had always loved sharing the news. It was just like an element of myself that I could never deny. Never did anything about it. And then a friend who is now my best friend and business partner at that time, complete stranger, uploaded something to social media saying, hi, does anyone want to start a new news page? I think it's going to be the next biggest thing. If anyone knows my business partner, Sam, it is very much in line with his unfettered optimism to think that something that hasn't even launched or isn't even an idea is the next big thing. But we went for coffee. And I was the only person that responded to that social media call out. So by a process of elimination, it was just me. And we went for coffee and we spent hours just talking about the news and talking about why it was that we were both the friends in our very distinct friends groups who would get asked to explain what was happening, you know, in China or what was happening here and why it was that people were showing obvious curiosity but yet couldn't quite get to the point of accessing the answers themselves. And so that day, at a lovely cafe in Bondi, we started the Daily Oz. We decided we were going to post 5 news stories every single day on stories, Instagram stories. It was like new and novel then. And that the 5th one would always be a good news because one of the things that we hear all the time is that the news is too negative and that the news is really depressing and it's really hard to engage with the news when everything is bloody dark, which it is. And I do not blame people that say that. But we wanted to eliminate that barrier and we wanted to take away that reason because just because it's dark doesn't mean you need to turn away. It just means that there needs to be some lightness throughout and that is the human experience and that is reality. And so we started it that day. I was working a full-time job. Sam was...
Oh, so you were both still working.
Sam was an M&A lawyer who very much was not paying attention to his day job, and we just did it every single day for a number of years. And to be quite frank, no one really cared in those
Except
early
the
days.
mums. The mums always...
Mum, shout out, she's still in the front row. We did it every single day knowing there was no one watching, but we knew that building consistency and building habit
building good
was
content.
where it was at. And so we did it day in, day out. Sometimes it was 6 a.m. before work. Other times it was 9 p.m. after work. But we knew that people were coming to us slowly, very slowly, for a reason. And so we did that, and then throughout COVID, things kind of escalated, and from there.
But I was going to say, like, I followed you guys during the lockdown because you were the only newsroom actually pulling the stats together.
Newsroom feels like a generous term when it was me sitting at a desk, pondering my future. But yes.
But like, honestly, you were the ones who were like pulling it together in a really accessible way. And so I'm assuming that was like the turning point for you guys.
It was a huge turning point. I always say that not caring about politics is a privilege, and that is because if you don't care about what our elected representatives are doing or saying, it means you don't rely on the government for income, or you don't rely on the government for healthcare or infrastructure. And so during COVID, nobody could afford not to care, and suddenly every single person had to care about our political system.
Yeah.
And we knew that we had a responsibility there to make it as accessible as possible. It also helped that we had no red tape of like an editor or a fact checker or any of the things we have now. It was the two of us at home. I'm pretty sure my brother was like the 8th person in the country who came in with COVID from the UK, and it was just an absolute absurd time.
Yeah.
But from there, we just saw this exponential growth, and we did it day in, day out, and we never kind of departed from that key tenet of like, we're going to make it as accessible as possible. If you can't leave your house, we're going to tell you why, how, and what you can do. So COVID was really big, but then we also had the US election and we had the Black Lives Matter movement. And it was kind of these three things together that everyone was paying attention and no one could ignore. And through that, we saw the growth really of the Daily Oz.
And I think like even today, like 2 years on, you've really stayed true to like that accessibility point. And also kind of been like the older friend who can like give you the information.
I love that.
I've heard you say that quote before that's like, you don't talk down to your audience, you talk across to them. And I feel like that's such a good piece of advice, especially for like missing perspective.
I was going to say that's exactly what I feel about missing perspectives, is that it's the voice that you haven't heard before, but it's speaking to you, and it's speaking across from you as somebody who can impart. Because I think the problem is that when we see traditional media talk to young people, often it's the case that it's the avocado toast. It's the like not overtly condescending, but
that's the latest one, that guy who said something around unemployment.
Yes. He's since retracted his statement about 8 days too late. But I think that it's just about, I think the merit in what we do is that we are our audience in the same way that you are, is that we know what young people want because we are young people. And we're not young people who actually have older legacy media people holding the money buckets. We're making the financial decisions behind the business. That that includes who we advertise with, how we sponsor, each part of our news, and then also how we write our news. And so I think that it's been that relationship that we hear exactly what our audience wants, and we can hopefully give them what they need.
Yeah, how do you hear what they want? Like,
we hear it so often in so many ways.
Just in the DMs.
Yes. So I think that being social first is extraordinary in so many ways because you feel so connected to your audience all the time. But it is this 24-hour feedback loop. So we can put up a post and know very quickly what people think about that. And we realised quite early that was a huge superpower. And so we started rolling out surveys and polling.
Yeah, I've seen that.
So often we say, oh, young people think this or young people think that. And it was just this attempt to actually quantify and have some sort of rigour behind what we were saying. And so, during COVID, we would get upwards of 60,000 responses to a poll. And we still, on something like The Voice, have been able to survey our audience and come to the conclusion that this is what they're thinking, this is what they're feeling, this is what they need to know more about, and here's how we can plug those knowledge gaps.
Yeah, so it's good you're like having that conversation with the audience.
It's a two-way conversation.
But was it you who, when you were going to the budget, you were like to your audience, what do you guys care about? And they were like, tax.
Yeah,
You just had to become a tax expert.
Yes, no, they didn't give us a light answer on that. It was the first time we had been in budget lockup, and for anyone that hasn't been in a budget lockup, it's your worst nightmare. It's literally being locked in a room with journalists, politicians, and budget papers. And the first time we did it a couple of years ago, it was like, how do we get to the bottom of what young people want really, really quickly? We asked them. And I think that set the tone of what we've been able to maintain and uphold every single year, which is really rigorous, hard news about the budget for young people.
And I think back to like the accessibility piece, there's a really good quote that I heard that was traditional media starts at season 5, episode 10. In that they don't provide the context and there's an assumed level of knowledge. Yeah. And I think for us, like when we're covering news like Roe v. Wade, it's like try to strike the balance for your audience between providing enough context and information, but also making sure it's still accessible. But
and
it's really
making sure
hard.
that you're not being patronising.
Yeah,
at the same time. That Roe v. Wade's a brilliant example. I think we saw such widespread coverage of the decision and very little explanation of the context in which that had arisen and what the role of the Supreme Court is and what the precedent was and all of that. And it means that we're never the first to report news because we have to take the time to explain it. But I think that that's far more valuable in my eyes.
Yeah. And do you want to start moving into breaking news?
No, it's not our space. I mean, we don't try to be slow, but I think that what we see ourselves moving into in the future is more of the original storytelling and telling the stories of young people, not necessarily being quick to do so, but being first to do so. We want to, the next big thing that happens to inevitably a young person who is taken advantage of or whatever else it is, wage theft, we want to be telling those stories because we believe we can do it well.
Come to you. Yeah. No, I love that. Okay, so going back, the Daily Oz, you're now reaching like 250,000 young people a day, which I assume is an outdated stat because I think you're reaching more now across platforms. So how did you decide to like turn your passion project on the side into your full-time job? Because I think for me, that was like the hardest decision I've ever had to make, like leaving a stable job.
It's a huge decision. It was so difficult, and I think it's often really glorified. I think that we so often hear about, bootstrapping and you just got to quit your job, you've got to do the hustle. Like the reality is I only left my job when I had the financial security to do so. Throughout COVID, as I said, there was quite a bit of attention, and then at the end of COVID, we started getting some investors showing interest in what we were doing. And so we were able ultimately to raise capital that gave us financial freedom to be able to quit our jobs. But I mean, I quite frankly would have never quit my job if it wasn't for that. My risk appetite is far too low.
Yeah.
And I think that we really glorify it, and that if you can't pay your rent, you can't be giving your all to your business. And that ultimately I think it's bullshit. So it was a decision that was made easier by the circumstance I found myself in, which was that we had investors that backed the idea that we had and were willing to take a risk on us. And also having a best friend to do it with at the same time. Like
Who's
Sam and I quit.
M&A lawyer.
Yeah, exactly. But we quit our jobs on exactly the same day.
Yeah.
The first day that we decided we were going to go full time, we sat in a cafe and looked at each other and said, well, what do we do now?
Yeah.
Like we're full time.
That's
we
the
quit
thing,
our
when
jobs.
you finally are in the position to do it full time, it's so scary.
I was like, how do I occupy a whole day?
Yeah.
I've been doing this in 10 minutes every day. Suddenly it's my whole job. And that was very daunting. And from there, we just had to start building routine out of no experience.
Yeah.
And nothing can prepare you for a blank slate because, we knew what we were doing, but we hadn't ever done it on that scale, and learn a lot, make a lot of mistakes, and figure it out as you go.
Yeah, it's definitely the startup roller coaster is a journey.
How did you decide that you thought it was the time to
For
quit your job?
me, it was, I think, when investors were showing interest. Like, I think that was the big one. But ultimately, it was probably my mum and family who, like, pushed me into doing it. And I think once we signed a brand deal that really gave us the funding to be able to do it full time, like, I think what you said before about you need to be able to pay the bills.
Yeah.
And bootstrapping can be glorified. But I think it was that getting investor interest gave me the validation that I needed. Because before then, it was just like young women running this little media company. And I think with that, when you start getting people who are interested and you start feeling like a really professional business, that's when I thought we'll take the leap.
Yeah.
But like, it's definitely the hardest decision I've ever made.
Yeah.
But it's
paid
also
off.
Yeah, but I think it's also why I say to people, throw your 5-year plan out the window. Because like this job we're doing now, we would never have thought existed.
No.
But we both just saw these gaps. I just went for it.
A 5-year plan, never had one. And I think it would have been to my detriment to have had one, because you're right, it didn't exist. Made it exist.
But like going back to the start of like missing perspectives, I think for me, like similar to what you were just saying, like the news really not speaking to young people. I think for me, the thing that drives me crazy is when people say women aren't interested in the news. And I think women are interested in the news. They're just not being spoken to, like much like the Daily Oz and what you're trying to tackle. And I think a really good example is like sports journalism, how you've got, it's the biggest sports category in Australia. Women have the lowest engagement with that category. But then you look at the stats within sports journalism and 83% of reporters are men. And the output of that is that 75% of the content focuses on women, on men's sport.
Yeah.
And it's just like, obviously women are going to engage less when the content is dominated and being produced by men. And I also think that the Women's World Cup and the Matildas was such a game changer because we saw female reporters being front and centre in telling the stories that matter.
And the viewership numbers,
and then it pushed up, like we saw women engaging with sport. And I just think that's what we're trying to do at Missing Perspectives. And I think it's exactly what you've done with TDA, where you're seeing young people engaging with the news because they're seeing themselves in the news.
And I would also add that to the myth that women don't care about news, that 85% of our audience is women.
Yeah, that's why we have similar audiences.
And that's not, we've never tried to go after women. We've never tried to attract women. It's not, I mean, I don't know how you do that in the first place, but we didn't do it. They have naturally found themselves a place with what we are doing. And the engagement that we see and the deep interest we see is just the best antidote to that myth.
So how did your audience become predominantly women? Like, do you know what? It just...
I mean, I think influencers probably have a role because they would speak to their large audiences about what we were doing and they were probably predominantly women. But other than that, I genuinely don't have a hypothesis. It just happened that way. And, you know, we started a sports page when Sam was particularly bored one day during COVID that he just unilaterally created TDA Sport. And we thought that that might be a way that we would like balance the audience, that if we started a sports page and we got like 20,000 followers in one day and they were all women. So that clearly women enjoyed the news.
But I also love what you're doing with Nike around like empowering young female journalists.
Yeah, so I mean, trying to figure out how you can work with commercial partners in a really meaningful way is something that's very important to us because we're not particularly interested in just shoving ads down people's throats and hoping that they enjoy that because no one does enjoy that. And so, you know, we've partnered with Nike for a female accelerator program for female sports journalists. And for us, that's a really meaningful way to have a commercial relationship with a partner that's actually doing some good. So we've had a whole cohort who just finished this week who are now going out into the kind of journalism ecosystem and all pursuing sports journalism and are all so talented and have so much to offer, but had never kind of had the avenues to explore that. Especially that niche of women's sport. And I think that, you know, they deserve to have that space and to tell those stories. And we know, as you said, that the storytelling is more compelling when done by the people, you know, that you're talking about.
Yeah. And like, I don't want to go to town on this because I could do a TEDx talk, but like women are so underrepresented in the news industry. like, I think 15% of protagonists in the news industry globally are women. Like, the stats are dire, and it's pretty bad in Australia too. And I think it's slightly improving, but still really low. But what I love about both of our newsrooms is that they're like women-led in that both of our editors-in-chief are amazing women. And like, do you think having an amazing, like Billy as your editor has really shaped the way your news is made and like speaking to the female audience?
Interesting. I don't know if I've ever thought about it that way. I think that we, if nothing else, have modelled what it's like to have strong young women lead a newsroom. So we're now up to 19 or 20 staff, and I think that it's incredible for our new team members who are leaving uni or still at uni to see a newsroom led by a 25-year-old woman who is also an alumni of here. And I just think that it's more that it's the experience that she knows of our audience. Like what I always say about Billy is that she knows so deeply what our audience needs and wants because she is that. She knows full well what conversations her friends are having. And I think it's that talent that's been able to propel her career, certainly within the Daily Oz. But again, it's never been a concerted effort to go and target women. It's just happened, and I don't see it as an issue. I absolutely will lean into it, but it was never intended.
And so going back to the brand that you've built, like I think a core pillar of TDA, sorry, the Daily Oz, I keep saying just TDA. TDA is trust. Like it is such a core pillar of your brand. And I was just wondering, like, how did that come about? And does it also mean, like, when you partner with brands like Nike, the stakes are a lot higher? Because when you partner with a brand, it's like giving them your stamp of approval. So how does that work?
So trust is a very, very fundamental value for our company for one reason only, that nobody trusts the news. That we have record low levels of trust in news, and that is another reason that people turn away. Again, we want to remove that obstacle. There is no reason why, there are many reasons why people don't trust it in Australia, but there is no reason why moving forward, new players can't, smash that down. And I think that if you start from day one suggesting that you will have a transparent relationship with your audience, I think that sets you up for success. And I mean, we've done it in a number of ways. For us, it was that, the days that we wanted to spend the very little money we did have on Facebook ads to get newsletter subscribers, because that's the way that we were monetizing, because you can put ads in newsletters, and we didn't want to put ads on Instagram and whatever else. We put up a post saying, hi, we were going to spend $1,000 on Facebook ads. To be honest, we really don't want to. We don't have it all work. So if you could sign up for our newsletter, that would mean the world to us. And we saw this huge surge in newsletter signups because people genuinely appreciated the transparency.
But radical transparency. Like it's not normal.
But it shouldn't be radical. There's simply no reason. And I think that we have tried to do that in every way. If we mess up, we will absolutely.
100%.
And we did it last week. We used, it was a story of a court case, and we used the language of the judge that upon reflection was inappropriate language. It was about, a certain act, and it was offensive to survivors of sexual assault. And we took it down and we put it up again and made clear in the caption that we had removed that, and that we had, we were really sorry for any offence caused, and that we wore responsibility for that. And I just think, like, you don't need to hide it at the back of, the... What's it called in the back of a newspaper when...
the little thing at the end.
Yeah, the little thing, that thing. There's no reason. And, we got so many messages saying, thanks so much for taking it down so quickly.
But that's the thing, and I think that also helps you with your position as, like, being the friend. And, like, being super... And I think that's why they trust you, and I think that's why... Like, it's just been interesting in the Australian news landscape. We've seen trust in media is at an all-time low. But we're also seeing the big players like the ABC struggle to engage with young people. And statistics came out, I think, like a month or so ago around the ABC's audience. And it was so interesting. And I think 8% of the ABC's flagship news audience was under the age of 40, which is wild. And you have an executive at the ABC calling themselves the Grey BC. They have a problem. Not sure if they've reached out to you for help.
There is a problem, but I also think that we never see ourselves as the full media diet. Like, I'm not particularly interested in someone only consuming the Daily Oz or only consuming Missing Perspectives.
But a lot of your audience does only consume the Daily Oz.
But I hope that, and I mean, like, we have a whole chapter in the book about media literacy and about how to actually read the news. I hope that we are actually just equipping people with the skills and the, you know, I guess, appetite to go out and see. Because, for example, we don't do opinion. Yeah. There's absolutely a place for opinion, you know, pieces. That's not with us. But we want to give you the foundation of knowledge so that you can go out and you can seek opinion. And I don't want us to be the start and the finish of someone's news diet, because I don't think that that's complete. And, you know, 20 people in a newsroom in Sydney cannot give you everything that you need.
Yeah.
But we want to... we always said it, the entree to the news diet. I don't know where it came from. It sounds even wankier when you say it out loud than when it's written down. But, like, that's how we see ourselves, that you will graduate into an ABC viewer, or you will graduate into a Sydney Morning Herald or an Australian
it's interesting
reader.
You say it that way.
I think that we see ourselves going after non-news people. So people that we're never going to read the news.
Like the news for non-news people.
Yeah. Because it's the passive news consumer that we're on social media. So if you are scrolling on Instagram, you'll see Phoebe, my friend, and then you'll see the news. And you wouldn't have ordinarily gone to news.com.au, or you wouldn't have ordinarily gone to this, but because it's in your way, you are now a news consumer. And so I hope that then has lasting effects, even when, you know, Instagram isn't the hottest thing or whatever it is. That
Threads.
That you have the skills and the appetite to want to continue that news journey throughout your life, because it shouldn't be limited and it shouldn't start and finish with any one publication. I feel quite strongly about that.
I really like that. And, like, if people want sport, they can go to, like, the Female Athlete Project to, like, bring it all together.
Exactly.
No, it's interesting you say it that way, because I would have thought a lot of people will stick with TDA.
They do. I don't think they listen to me. They do, and that's obviously wonderful for us. But in terms of the broader kind of what we hope as a society we get to is that I think you need to also seek out different perspectives. I think that the art of a healthy debate has been lost. And I think that's because we exist in echo chambers and people aren't seeking out or trying to converse with people that might not agree with them. Again, there are publications, there are places in order to seek that. That's not with us, but I would encourage people to continue that journey.
But it's interesting seeing, like, the bigger players trying to emulate what you're doing. And we saw the Australian launch their youthful publication, the Oz, which folded after a year, I'm pretty sure. So, interested to hear your thoughts on that. Like, what do you think makes it work? Is it essentially just not being linked to a traditional news company?
I think there are a couple issues, but I think that namely it's what I said before about, like, even if you've got a really incredible editorial kind of group, like if you look at the Oz, it was all young women in that.
Leading it.
Leading it. Ultimately, the business decisions were not made by them, though. The business decisions were made by Lachlan Murdoch. And I think that ultimately, if, you know, youth news is not a quick game. You're not going to get people paying for the news straight away. You're going to have to fight for interest. It's a kind of long game. And I think that if you are a traditional player and you don't see that revenue coming in straight away, or it doesn't seem like it's working, you can just pull that really quickly, as we saw with the Oz. And I think that ultimately there wasn't an inherent understanding about kind of user behaviours and how long that user journey is. And so I think that had the decision-making come from, you know, the group that was actually driving the editorial, I think we might have probably doesn't make much sense. We could have seen a different outcome.
No, that's really interesting. So, okay, wrapping up, I think this is the final question. But I think we were at a dinner party one night and we all went around and said a high and a low. You said your high was the role you felt that TDA...
I thought you were going to say my low, and I was like, that is
your
personal,
low
Phoebe.
in front of everyone.
Yes.
Your high was the role that TDA played in the federal election last year, and the role that you felt.
You make me sound like such a nerd that I said that at a dinner party, a social dinner party.
But
anyway.
That's
okay.
But the role, like how you felt you empower young people and equip them, and I just think the role you guys are playing and that we're trying to play is so important. especially in the context of the upcoming referendum. And I think that's also why your book is so important, because you're really equipping people with the skills. And like, what are your goals with the upcoming referendum in terms of like upskilling and informing young people?
It's a really good question. I think that there is lots to do. And I think that for us, we see our key role as providing as much of a civics education as possible. Like I said about our role during the election, we saw record youth enrolment, and that was something that we were really proud of because we worked with the AEC to drive that youth enrolment. And we ran a big campaign with them around that. And so for this, I think that there are so many voices that need to be listened to, that need to be platformed. And I see our role as telling that story, but also reminding people that, 95% of our audience wouldn't have ever voted in a referendum before, let alone been alive at the last election. Last referendum. I was 2. And so how can we create a space where people feel comfortable to ask about what a referendum actually is, what the Constitution actually is, how this happens, like the mechanics behind it. I just think that is the part that they perhaps won't be getting anywhere else. And I think for us, that's where we can really add value alongside the storytelling that comes. And, we're doing a 4-part video series on The Voice. We've got a journalist who's gone to Fitzroy Crossing to speak to local communities. We are absolutely doing as much as we can there, but I want that to sit alongside a civics education so that people can feel like they're making an informed vote in every sense of the word.
No, and that's super important. And I saw today on the Daily Oz, you shared the news, but I think there was like record enrollment for the referendum, which is incredible.
It is incredible.
So that's enough for me. Wrapping up, I'm following the time very closely. I think I deserve a medal. Throwing to the Q&A.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. Zara, I have actually been following your journey from fairly early on and got my uni student kids onto it as well. But I also really appreciated your comments about sort of having a sort of an overall diet, of media. So I think that's a really strong point to keep making and sustaining. What I'm really interested in is, obviously I'm not a young person. How many of your audience or your readers are older people?
It's a great question, and thank you for your support. I really appreciate it. So 80% of our audience is under the age of 35, and 85%, as I said before, are women. And our most frequent message that we get is, I'm not your target audience, but, and it's usually followed up with, but I think it's really useful, or but this. And so we've had so many discussions in the office about the fact that we never want people to feel like it's not for them. Because just because we say we're talking to young people, I don't want anyone that falls outside that strict category of whatever that is to feel like it's not for them. But I think when we talk about wanting to target young people, I feel like young people are underserved by traditional media, and that is what I'm trying to rectify. And so it is not that I want to exclusively communicate with young people, but that I want young people to know that there is a space that they can come to that is for them. And so there are lots of people. I mean, we've got 500,000 followers now on Instagram, and so that 20% is a big number, and I know that they derive value from it, and I want them to continue. I also just want young people to know that while the pedestrian and the junkie and all these great pop culture news services exist, that they also have a hard news service that they can turn to for political analysis and the like, and that there is that space.
And I just thought it's interesting talking about like trying not to alienate a certain audience or demographic, because I think as feminist media, like you really don't want to alienate men, because you want them to be part of the conversation, and also that's how change happens.
Absolutely.
And I think that's been something our editorial team has really thought through recently, in that we don't want men to feel excluded from these conversations. Like, we really want them to bring them on board and engage with our content.
It's the accessibility point.
Yeah.
Everyone should feel that it's accessible. Yeah.
Love accessibility. Is there another question from the floor before we dive into?
Hi, thank you so much, Phoebe and Zara. My name's Genevieve, and I come from the narrative side of film and TV, so storytelling is my world. And you mentioned about originals, that you would potentially move into creating stories that is narrative form. how do you see that happening for your audience, and how would you engage the influencers that you already have? And the other part that was really interesting was you said they would graduate into a different media source they would go to. But I struggled in the last decade to find any media source now that I would truly trust anymore. Having grown up here and seen the changes in media, there's not one publication I would go to. I go overseas for my news. And I just came across your Instagram account today, and I think I'm your target audience. So I'm like, shit, what happened? They missed me. Maybe because I'm intersectional and in a different CAD group, and I would love to know what your readership is of culturally and linguistically different and LGBTIQ and of different abilities across the spectrum as well.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questions there.
So many questions. I love them all. And I think that Phoebe would also be really well placed to answer this, because that is literally Missing Perspectives' whole mission is to platform, as you said, the diversity of everyone, and that media should be a place for everyone. So I think that it is about, for us, how we can take people on a journey when they aren't necessarily used to being taken on a kind of media journey. And so for us, it's maintaining that accessibility, but finding the right stories to explore that kind of longer form stuff. So, for example, we know that young people are less likely to sit and watch a 9-minute video on Instagram than perhaps their peers, but we have found a way. We upload a carousel of 1-minute videos that you swipe along and you have that journey. And so it mimics the consumption habits of young people, which is that we know that we are very used to doing this. But at the end of it, you've watched a 10-minute video about tax and you don't quite realise you've watched a 10-minute video about tax. And the algorithm doesn't quite know you've watched a 10-minute video about tax. And so it's through mediums like that of finding newer ways to keep an audience who, you know, for all the stereotypes and all the myths, we do have a shorter attention span. How are we engaging them, and how can we tell those stories? So, for example, we did a 4-part kind of exploration of Julia Gillard's misogyny speech, and we took people through over an hour the journey through this podcast, because, again, much of our audience was in school or not even during that speech. And so it's finding the right ways to tell those stories and the right mediums to match it that's really front of mind for us. And also that one of the traditional critiques of the Daily Oz, which you hopefully haven't read if you only found us today, is that we recycle other people's journalism. So that is what we have often been criticised by traditional media as having done. If anyone is interested, I can debunk that. But for us, it's we want to get as far away from that criticism as possible, which we don't believe to be based in fact, but also we want to tell the stories exclusively of young people. And so, you know, we exclusively reported something about mental health subsidies recently, and HECS and those types of things that we know matter but aren't necessarily being told.
But I think a point around, even for us, like trialing different forms of storytelling, in that with our website, so our website has a completely different audience to our social media. So our website is like extremely global. Like we have readers in like, I think now 130 countries, but our social media is like young women in pretty much like Sydney and Melbourne. Don't know how that happened, but a thing, like a difficult piece we've tried to tackle is like, we publish long form content on our website, but it doesn't really translate into like the usual carousel on social media. So at the moment we're getting like content creators to bring their stories to life with like a green screen with our article and just produce it in a more accessible way. So I think it's like trying to figure out, like if we have a long form article about the experiences of young women under the Taliban, figuring out how to like translate that article across TikTok, Instagram, and I don't know if you've had a similar thing where like the same piece of content is conveyed differently on each platform.
Every platform.
But no, yeah, and I find that video is now very much the dominant form of content that people are engaging in. So yeah, thank you for your question.
Oh, you did have a second question.
Oh.
What should you graduate into? I think that I wouldn't want to tell anyone what to read, except to say that the only way that independent media can survive is if it is supported. And so I think that if there is local media or there are, local creators, like for example, we were just speaking before, there's somebody who has started making videos on Instagram that are absolutely exceptional, and he has done 8-minute video explainers about the housing crisis, and he's getting far more views than any major news outlet is, but he's one person. And I think that as we move through this kind of creator economy space, those are the people that are also going to get the attention of young people, and I think that we need to give them credit where credit's due. And so I think that those are the types of things that we'll be seeing a lot into the future as well, not just the kind of standard mastheads.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for such a stimulating conversation. My name's Ava and I'm from the Australian Baha'i community. A few weeks ago at the Canberra Writers' Festival, Stan Grant, in conversation with Louise Milligan, was speaking about the inherent conflict-based assumption that a lot of contemporary journalism is based on, and the sort of divisive effects that it has, as we can see right now with The Voice and the referendum, and many examples. And he sort of started to talk about what some alternative assumptions that news could be based on. And I just wondered what your perspectives were on that. There's journalists are trained that conflict makes a good story, but actually it's not really working. It's a failed business model. So yeah, I was curious to hear your thoughts, and also what the role of, I guess, news journalism is in strengthening social cohesion, particularly at a time where issues are dividing us more than they're actually informing us.
Phoebes?
But I think to your question, it's also really interesting when you're social first, in that conflict-based posts tend to do better, which is a terrible part of social media, but it actually drives growth. And I think you see a lot of media companies who are social first veering towards more clickbait, attention-grabbing content, which I think is really dangerous. And I think for us, we're really focused on making sure people are informed and making sure our community is really positive. I'm not sure about how you...
I think I just point to the fact that we do the good news every day. I think that stands... I don't even know where to begin with that, but I think that he's right, and that our entire industry needs rethinking. And I think the assumptions that underpin our entire industry need rethinking. And I also think it's the commercial models that I think actually are the thing that I'd point to, because I think that no one goes out or goes into journalism wanting to get to the place that we have gotten as an industry. I think that ultimately commercial strains have gotten us here, and it's been the worst possible thing. We've seen regional news shut down, we've seen hard papers, whatever, and I just think that if we start rethinking commercial models for media, I truly think that we will end up in a much better place as an industry. And so that's why, again, I just encourage as much support as you can for independent media that can undermine the presumption that it has to be this way, that we have to lean into this conflict first kind of reporting and these assumptions, because I don't think that anything is a foregone conclusion. I just think that we've all gotten comfortable here. But I think it's a really sad state of affairs. And I think it's even worse when it is people's first kind of interaction with the news and that all they know is this. And so I hope that in the fact that we are the first touch point for so many people, that we can change the way that is. But, we, as I said, our staff are predominantly under the age of 25 and are already jaded by the industry. So it's our job to make sure that there is good leadership and that it doesn't just go on this way.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered the question, but it was a brilliant question. And I also think that while there are many detriments to social media, the social cohesion that, for example, can be built through communities in comment sections or in Facebook groups, I do think that there is huge value in that. And I have seen and felt the community that has been built around us of people that feel very comfortable discussing and talking about what they think and feel on any particular issue. And I think that there is merit to that too.
So just tied to that, how do you approach content moderation? Because we had never thought about content moderation or community management until our audience grew during the Women's World Cup. And one of my friends was like, hey, you should really start moderating your comment section because it's getting really toxic. And that was the first time I'd even thought about it.
The first time I thought about content moderation was when I was on Q&A, and it was the first time I'd done live television. They asked what our policy was, and we didn't have a policy. And I decided in that moment that we were going to have a policy.
We're going to have a policy.
But we moderate hate speech of any description.
Yeah, just delete.
So that's very important to us. And I mean, we have to understand that we are also working within the resources possible, that we can't have someone on 24 hours a day because that is impossible. And I feel very strongly about not turning off comments unless there is a legal risk. So we leave comment sections on, and it's just about making sure that hate speech is removed, however that may materialise, but that everything else, because I truly think like anytime there is argument or conversation or something else that is said in the comment section, it becomes a really excellent place for other people to learn. Because other people jump in and they have conversation, and I think that it can be really productive.
Yeah.
Nice.
Any other?
My question is around the commercial model because, as you know, that's the media or die or not on whether it's financially viable. So what is your commercial model, and how do you say, I think on your website, that you keep the people who support you financially have no say editorially, and what guarantee do your readers have of that? Do you display on your website who supports you, where you get your money from, how much money you get? How transparent can that be?
It's a great question. We don't display that just because we've never had to, or no one's ever asked, and we would be more than happy to. So we have 11 individual investors who backed us in what was a raise at that time. And their role with us is that we send them a monthly update on the commercial kind of state of our business. And that is the only interaction that we have with them. They have never picked up the phone and told us anything about our editorial. And it's been reported in the newspapers. I'm very happy to talk to you about who those people are. Some of them have worked in news, others not so much. They were just kind of family and friends round. And in terms of our commercial model, to be honest, we're still working it out, and we're still trying different things. But like Phoebe pointed to the Nike partnership, that's one way through sponsorship kind of commercial opportunities that we're trying to do. So we do plain advertising in our newsletter, in our podcast, in video form. It will always be explicitly recognised as having been paid for and who paid for it. So it would never be native in the sense that it's, the top 10 cafes in Sydney and number one is this, and we forgot to tell you that they paid for that position, which frankly a lot of youth media especially is doing. But so if you have ever seen a video on our Instagram, it would say the first tile is this was paid for by X. So whether that be Future Super or another brand, and that they had no editorial input in this process. And that is on the front of any commercial partnership that we do. And so we do it through that way. We also derive some revenue through the polling, as I said. So brands can pay to ask questions of our audience, and they don't get that data. What they get is just the results of, as in they don't get who has answered any of that. They get the results of 65% of the Daily Oz's audience believe X, Y, Z. That will also be clearly labelled as a partnership of some description, and it's another way for brands to understand the behaviours and the attitudes and the purchasing power of young people. And so we are working through all the different kinds of ways that we can do this. And, we wrote a book, and all the proceeds of the book are going back into the business.
Oh, awesome.
And that is funding more journalists for us. So it's no one thing, but I'd say advertising takes up the biggest kind of role for us, but Phoebe's.
But I think figuring out a business model when you're a newsroom is really hard. And for us, like similar to Zara and the Daily Oils, like a lot of our revenue comes from brand partnerships, like really meaningful brand partnerships, and a lot of them are long-term, which is amazing. And then to make sure we have sustainable revenue, we've also built an app, like a software product that we're launching next month. And it's essentially like a two-sided marketplace that is going to connect media enterprises and newsrooms with young female reporters so they can like filter for like country qualification. And through that, we're like trying to get more young female reporters on the radar of international newsrooms. So that for us, like we're thinking I'll like probably have a subscription-based model, but it's like looking at opportunities like that and kind of like your polling that I think a lot of us are trying to branch out. So yeah, great question. Okay, I think we're being told, wrapping up, but one more question, which I love from Slido. As young female entrepreneurs, what is your biggest challenge in pioneering your ideas?
Why don't you answer?
I think literally before we started talking tonight, we were discussing, like, for me, I think it's doing a capital raise, which I think the odds are also not working in your favor when 2% of capital goes to female founders. And then it's like for women of color too. The statistics are even worse. And I think for women in like the venture capital and investing space, that for me has been one of the biggest challenges. And also just like not knowing the language of the investor world. Like I was in a meeting last week and they were like, cool, can we see your data room? And I just had to go home and Google like, what is a data room? Because I'm like, where are you meant to learn these things? So I think it's like a lot of learning on the job, and that for me would be the biggest challenge. I don't know about.
I think the biggest challenge for me has just been trying to build the plane and fly it at the same time. I think that never having done this before, not having ever managed a single person and suddenly having to manage our whole team, not having really in any meaningful way worked in journalism, and having to learn the ins and outs of an industry that is at times quite secretive about, you know, how it can work and how it operates. I think that has been the challenging part of like doing the day-to-day while still trying to upskill the kind of strategic thinking. I think it's the building the plane and flying it that's been the most challenging for me.
But it's a fun journey.
It is.
Despite
it's a fun
the
plane
tears.
that might crash, but hopefully doesn't.
So we'll wrap up there, but thank you everyone. I'm sorry we had a lot of questions that we didn't get to, but hang around after and we can have a drink and answer them there. But thank you so much. I'm Phoebe, and thanks for coming to Sydney Ideas.